The German soldiers heard it before they saw it, a sound like 1,000 demons screaming through the air. Then the sky turned black with rockets. Not one or two, but hundreds, all at once, turning day into night. These were Stalin's organs, the Katyusha rocket launchers that could fire 320 rockets in 10 seconds, drowning entire battlefields in explosive fire. Wehrmacht veterans who had conquered France, who thought they'd seen everything war could offer, found themselves paralyzed with terror, crying like children. One German officer wrote in his diary, "Hell has a sound, and we heard it today." The Soviets had created something that violated everything Germans understood about warfare. Not precision, but saturation. Not accuracy, but pure, overwhelming terror. In a single barrage at Orsha, an entire German battalion simply ceased to exist. But here's what nobody talks about. The Soviet soldiers operating these weapons couldn't sleep afterward, haunted by the anonymous thousands they'd killed without ever seeing. What happens when war becomes so terrible that even the winners are traumatized? And why did one German veteran say the Katyusha's screaming saved more lives than it took? July 14, 1941, marked a transformation in warfare that neither the Wehrmacht nor the world had anticipated. 3 weeks into Operation Barbarossa, German forces had been advancing through Soviet territory with the same swift precision that had brought them victory in Poland, France, and across Europe. The Wehrmacht's confidence was not misplaced. They had destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft on the ground, captured hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers, and were advancing on 3 fronts toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. German military doctrine, refined through 2 years of combat, emphasized coordinated attacks, precise artillery bombardment, and the concentrated use of armor to punch through enemy lines. It was a system that had proven unstoppable. Captain Hans Kellner of the 17th Panzer Division embodied this confidence as he surveyed Soviet positions near Orsha in Belarus through his Zeiss binoculars. His unit had been advancing almost continuously since crossing the Soviet border on June 22nd. The Red Army appeared to be in complete collapse, its forces retreating in disorder, abandoning equipment and positions. Kellner had fought in Poland and France, had seen the best that European armies could offer crumble before German tactical superiority. The Soviets, with their purged officer corps and seemingly outdated equipment, appeared to offer even less resistance than the French had managed. At approximately 15 hours, Kellner noticed unusual vehicles among the Soviet positions. Trucks with strange rail-like structures mounted on their backs. Through his binoculars, they looked almost primitive, like agricultural equipment hastily converted for military use. Some of his fellow officers speculated they might be propaganda loudspeakers. Others thought they were some sort of bridge-laying equipment. The German intelligence reports had mentioned nothing about new Soviet weapons systems. The Abwehr had assured them that Soviet military technology was years behind German standards, still relying on equipment and doctrines from the First World War. This assumption would prove to be one of the most catastrophic intelligence failures of the war. The Soviet Union had been developing rocket artillery in absolute secrecy since 1921, in facilities so classified that even most Soviet generals didn't know of their existence. The program had been led by Georgy Langemak, a brilliant engineer who had recognized that rockets, while less accurate than conventional artillery, could deliver massive amounts of explosive to a target area in seconds rather than minutes. His work had produced the RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, simple, unguided weapons that individually were inferior to any German artillery piece, but collectively represented something entirely new in warfare. At 15:15 hours, the afternoon calm was shattered by a sound that defied description. Survivors would spend decades trying to convey what they heard, a howling, screaming wail that seemed to come from the very air itself, as if the sky was tearing apart. Within 10 seconds, 320 rockets launched from a battery of BM-13 Katyusha launchers, each rocket carrying 42 pounds of explosives. The weapons the Germans had dismissed as agricultural equipment had just delivered 4 tons of high explosive across an area equivalent to 4 football fields, and they had done it faster than any conventional artillery battery could fire a second salvo. Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm Hoffmann, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, was eating lunch with his squad when the barrage hit. His diary, recovered after the war, provides one of the most vivid accounts of this first Katyusha attack. The sound came first, like nothing I had ever heard. Not the whistle of artillery we knew, but a screaming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then the earth erupted, not in spots like artillery, but everywhere simultaneously. The ground heaved like water. Men were thrown into the air. Equipment, vehicles, everything was flying. I saw Dietrich, who had survived everything since Poland, simply disappear in a flash of fire and earth. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers who had advanced fearlessly against machine guns and conventional artillery found themselves paralyzed by this new weapon. Unlike traditional artillery, which provided warning through the whistle of incoming shells and arrived in a predictable pattern that experienced soldiers could read and react to, the Katyusha rockets arrived all at once with their distinctive banshee wail. There was no time to take cover, no pattern to read, no way to predict where the next salvo would land. The entire experience violated everything the Wehrmacht had been trained to expect. Within minutes of the first barrage, German radio networks were flooded with panicked reports. Units that had been advancing confidently were requesting immediate withdrawal. Veterans who had never shown fear were refusing to leave their foxholes. The normally disciplined Wehrmacht communication protocol dissolved into chaos as officers tried to understand what had happened. The term that appeared repeatedly in these first reports was Höllenmusik, Hell's music. Within days, the soldiers would have another name for these weapons, Stalin Orgel, or Stalin's organ, for the way the rockets seemed to play a terrible symphony of destruction. The Soviets had achieved complete tactical surprise, but the strategic implications were even greater. The Katyusha represented not just a new weapon, but a fundamentally different approach to warfare. Where German doctrine emphasized precision and control, the Soviets had embraced chaos and saturation. A single Katyusha launcher could deliver the explosive equivalent of a conventional artillery battery, but it could do so with a crew of just 3 men and could relocate within minutes of firing, making counter-battery fire almost impossible. The weapons were simple enough to be mass-produced in factories that had been evacuated beyond the Ural Mountains, using workers with minimal training. The mathematics of the weapon were staggering. A single BM-13 launcher carried 16 RS-132 rockets. A typical battery consisted of 4 to 6 launchers. This meant that a single battery could deliver between 64 and 96 rockets in under 10 seconds. Reloading took between 5 and 10 minutes, after which the battery could fire again. In terms of explosive power delivered over time, a Katyusha battery could match the output of an entire artillery regiment while requiring a fraction of the manpower and logistic support. The Germans had encountered not just a new weapon, but a revolution in the economics of destruction. The weapon that had just terrorized German forces at Orsha had a history steeped in Soviet paranoia, brilliance, and tragedy. The development of the Katyusha rocket system began in 1921, in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War, when the young Soviet state found itself technologically inferior to its potential enemies. The Gas Dynamics Laboratory in Leningrad, operating under conditions of extreme secrecy, had been tasked with developing weapons that could compensate for the Soviet Union's industrial limitations. Unlike Germany, which could produce sophisticated, precision-engineered artillery pieces, the Soviet Union needed weapons that could be manufactured quickly, using relatively simple processes. Georgy Langemak, the chief designer of what would become the Katyusha system, understood this fundamental constraint. His genius lay not in creating a superior weapon, but in reimagining what superiority meant. While German and Western military thinking emphasized accuracy and efficiency, placing each shell precisely where it would do the most damage, Langemak embraced a different philosophy. His rockets would be inherently inaccurate, but they would arrive in such numbers and with such speed that accuracy became irrelevant. It was an approach that reflected Soviet military doctrine. Quantity has a quality all its own. The bitter irony of Langemak's story epitomizes the madness of Stalin's purges. In 1937, at the height of his success in developing rocket weapons, Langemak was arrested on fabricated charges of being a German spy. On January 11, 1938, he was executed in the basement of the NKVD headquarters in Moscow. The man who had created the weapon that would help save the Soviet Union was dead 3 years before his invention would prove its worth. His colleague Ivan Gouvet, who had testified against Langemak to save his own life, would later receive the credit and the Hero of Socialist Labor Medal for the Katyusha's success. This grotesque injustice remained hidden for decades, with Langemak's family not learning of his fate until after Stalin's death. By the time of the German invasion in June 1941, the Soviet Union had managed to produce only about 40 experimental BM-13 launchers. The weapon was so secret that most Soviet commanders didn't know it existed. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself first learned about the Katyusha only days before its combat debut. The decision to deploy these weapons at Orsha was born of desperation. The Red Army was in full retreat, and something dramatic was needed to slow the German advance. Captain Ivan Flerov, commanding the first battery of 7 launchers, had orders that reflected the weapon's importance. Under no circumstances were the launchers to fall into German hands. Each vehicle was rigged with explosive charges, and the crews were instructed to destroy their weapons rather than allow capture. The aftermath of the Orsha barrage sent shockwaves through both armies. On the German side, urgent communications flew between field commanders and Berlin. The Wehrmacht High Command initially refused to believe the reports. Area saturation weapons violated German military philosophy, which prized precision and conservation of ammunition. Hitler himself, when informed of the attack, reportedly flew into a rage, demanding to know how the subhuman Soviets had developed a weapon that German science had not produced. Orders went out immediately. Capture a Katyusha launcher intact at any cost. Special units were formed with the sole mission of seizing these weapons, but Soviet crews proved fanatically devoted to their destruction orders. The psychological warfare aspect of the Katyusha extended beyond its explosive power. The sound it produced, that distinctive howling scream, became a weapon in itself. German soldiers would learn to recognize the sound from miles away, and the mere hint of it could trigger panic. Wehrmacht medical officers began reporting a new phenomenon: soldiers presenting with no physical wounds, but exhibiting symptoms of complete nervous breakdown after Katyusha attacks. They called it Katyusha shock, and unlike shell shock from conventional artillery, it seemed to affect even veterans who had shown no previous signs of combat stress. Lieutenant Friedrich Paulus, no relation to the field marshal, of the 296th Infantry Division, described his first experience under Katyusha fire in a letter to his wife that was never sent. Imagine you are standing in an open field when suddenly the air itself begins to scream. Not one scream, but hundreds, all slightly different in pitch, creating a symphony of terror. You have perhaps 2 seconds to comprehend what you're hearing before the world explodes. Not in one place, not in a pattern you can predict or avoid, but everywhere at once. The earth rises up, the air turns solid with shrapnel and dirt. Men you were just speaking with vanish as if they never existed. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stops. The silence afterward is almost worse than the barrage itself. On the Soviet side, the Katyusha crews faced their own psychological burdens. Unlike conventional artillery, where observers could adjust fire and see specific results, Katyusha operators fired blind into grid coordinates. They pulled their firing levers and sent death screaming toward an invisible enemy, never seeing the results of their work directly. Sergeant Katya Mikhailova, one of the few female Katyusha battery commanders, wrote in her diary, "We are dealers of wholesale death. I pull a lever, and somewhere, Perhaps a mile away, perhaps two. Germans die. Not a German, but Germans. Dozens, maybe hundreds. I don't see them fall. Don't know if they were good men or bad, young or old. I only know that they were there, and then they weren't. The production of Katyusha launchers became a priority that showcased both Soviet industrial capability and desperation. Factories that had been evacuated beyond the Urals, sometimes operating in conditions barely better than workshops, began producing launchers at an astonishing rate. By the end of 1941, despite losing much of its industrial base to German occupation, the Soviet Union had produced nearly 600 launchers. By 1942, that number would rise to over 3,000. The rockets themselves were even simpler to produce, essentially steel tubes filled with explosive and fitted with stabilizing fins. A factory that had previously made agricultural equipment could be converted to rocket production in days. The German response to the Katyusha threat revealed the limitations of their military innovation. The Wehrmacht did develop its own rocket artillery, the Nebelwerfer series. But these weapons never achieved the psychological or tactical impact of the Katyusha. German rockets were more accurate, their launchers more sophisticated, but they were also more expensive and time-consuming to produce. Where the Soviets could mount Katyusha launchers on any truck chassis, German rocket artillery required specialized vehicles. Where Soviet rockets could be manufactured by barely trained workers, German weapons demanded precision engineering. The Germans had created a superior weapon that they couldn't produce in sufficient numbers to matter. By November 1942, the Katyusha had evolved from a desperate secret weapon into the backbone of Soviet offensive operations. The battle for Stalingrad would demonstrate the full potential of massed rocket artillery in urban warfare, where the weapon's inaccuracy became irrelevant and its psychological impact was magnified by the enclosed spaces and echo chambers of a destroyed city. On November 19th, as Operation Uranus began, the massive counter-offensive to encircle the German Sixth Army. Over 3,500 artillery pieces and Katyusha batteries opened fire simultaneously in what remains one of the most concentrated bombardments in military history. German soldier Gottfried Becker, serving with the 76th Infantry Division, was manning an observation post when the barrage began. His letter to his mother, found on his body weeks later, captures the helplessness of being under such an attack. "Dearest Mother, if you receive this letter, know that I died thinking of you. For 3 days now, the earth has not stopped shaking. The Russians have weapons that scream like demons and fall like rain. We cannot see them to shoot back. We cannot run because there is nowhere to run. We cannot hide because the rockets find every cellar, every bunker. We simply wait and pray. But I think God has stopped listening to German prayers." The Soviet rocket forces had developed new tactics that multiplied their effectiveness. Rather than firing single batteries, they began concentrating multiple regiments, sometimes 200 or more launchers, for coordinated strikes. A full regiment could deliver 3,200 rockets in under 10 seconds, saturating an area of several square kilometers with high explosive. The mathematical precision of destruction was staggering. Each square meter of the target zone would statistically receive multiple hits. No amount of fortification, no depth of bunker could guarantee survival under such saturation. The crews operating these weapons were becoming increasingly aware of their terrible efficiency. Guards Sergeant Viktor Petrenko commanded a BM-13 launcher in the 8th Guards Mortar Regiment during the Stalingrad operation. In interviews conducted decades later, he recalled the moral weight of his service. "We would receive coordinates, usually just numbers on a map. Set elevation, set direction, fire. The rockets would scream away, and minutes later we'd pack up and move. Sometimes, advancing afterward, we'd drive through the areas we had hit. You'd see things, parts of things. German boys no older than my younger brother, scattered like broken dolls. We told ourselves they were fascists, invaders. But at night, when I closed my eyes, I saw those broken dolls." The German military was fracturing under the psychological strain of facing weapons they couldn't counter. Reports from Wehrmacht medical units describe a dramatic increase in combat stress casualties specifically attributed to rocket artillery. Unlike conventional artillery, which soldiers could learn to read and predict, the Katyusha created a sense of complete helplessness. Soldiers who had functioned normally under intense conventional bombardment would break completely after a single Katyusha barrage. The sound alone could trigger panic attacks in veterans. Some units reported desertion rates of 30% or higher after sustained rocket attacks. Hitler's response to the Katyusha threat revealed his increasing detachment from military reality. He demanded that German scientists develop countermeasures, but when told that the only effective defense was to prevent the Soviets from firing in the first place, requiring air superiority the Luftwaffe no longer possessed, he flew into characteristic rages. He ordered the development of superweapons to match Soviet rocket artillery, draining resources from more practical projects. The V-1 and V-2 programs, while technologically impressive, were partially born from Hitler's obsession with matching the psychological impact of the Katyusha, though they would never achieve the battlefield effectiveness of the simpler Soviet weapons. The human cost extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Soviet rocket troops suffered from what would now be recognized as moral injury, the psychological damage from participating in acts that violate one's moral beliefs. Many operators reported nightmares, inability to eat meat. The smell reminded them of burned flesh, and profound guilt about their role in the war. The Soviet military, which did not recognize psychological casualties as legitimate, offered no support. Men and women who showed signs of breaking down were often accused of cowardice or anti-Soviet sentiment. The only acceptable response was to drink, and alcoholism among rocket troops reached epidemic proportions. At Kursk in July 1943, the Soviets deployed over 1,000 Katyusha launchers in what would become the largest tank battle in history. But here, the weapon's limitations also became apparent. The open steppes around Kursk offered little cover, and German forces had finally developed some countermeasures. They learned to recognize the preparation signs, the movement of launcher vehicles into position, and could sometimes disperse before firing. More importantly, German tank crews discovered that moving armor was relatively safe from rocket attack, as the Katyusha's area saturation was less effective against dispersed, mobile targets. Yet even when the weapon was less effective tactically, its psychological impact remained devastating. Panzer Commander Major Wilhelm von Strachwitz described facing Katyusha barrages at Kursk. "Inside our Tigers and Panthers, we were relatively safe. The rockets couldn't penetrate our armor, but the sound, the constant impacts, the knowledge that outside our steel coffins was nothing but death. It wore on every man." After 3 days of constant rocket attacks, my veteran crews were showing signs of breakdown. Men who had faced T-34s without flinching were begging to withdraw from positions because of those screaming rockets. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 revealed the Katyusha's role as a political weapon. As the Polish Home Army rose against German occupation, expecting Soviet support, Stalin ordered his forces, including massive Katyusha batteries positioned across the Vistula River, to halt. Soviet rocket troops watched Warsaw burn, forbidden to fire the weapons that could have saved the uprising. Lieutenant Mikhail Dvorkin, commanding a battery of BM-31 heavy rocket launchers, later defected to the west and described the agony of those weeks. "We could see the fires, hear the fighting. Our rockets could have reached any point in Warsaw within minutes. The Germans were exposed, desperate. One concentrated barrage would have broken them, but our orders were clear. Do not fire. We watched the city die. Watched the Germans crush the Poles while we cleaned our launchers and waited. Some men cried, others got drunk. We all understood. Our rockets were Stalin's voice, and Stalin had chosen silence." January 1945 brought the Katyusha to German soil, and with it came a reckoning that would shatter the last illusions of the Third Reich. East Prussia, The heartland of Prussian military tradition faced the weapon that had terrorized German forces for 3.5 years. But now the victims would include civilians who had never imagined war could reach them with such mechanical fury. The Soviet offensive that began on January 12th employed over 450 Katyusha regiments, nearly 7,000 launchers capable of delivering 112,000 rockets in a single coordinated volley. The city of Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, became a laboratory for the ultimate expression of rocket artillery in urban destruction. The ancient Prussian city, with its medieval architecture and civilian population of 300,000, was surrounded by concentric rings of Katyusha batteries. The Soviet command had made a calculated decision. The city would be made an example. Not just defeated, but erased. The rocket barrages that began on January 15th continued almost without pause for weeks, delivering an estimated 500,000 rockets into an area of less than 50 square kilometers. Marianne Schultz, a nurse at Königsberg Central Hospital, kept a diary that survived the war hidden in the hospital's basement walls. Her entries from January 1945 reveal the civilian experience of industrial warfare. The howling never stops. It has become the soundtrack of our existence. Children no longer cry when the rockets fall. They have no tears left. They sit silent, staring at nothing, their minds gone somewhere the rockets cannot reach. Yesterday, little Hans, only 6 years old, asked me if the screaming in the sky was the angels crying because God had abandoned us. I had no answer. Perhaps he was right. The Soviet rocket troops conducting these barrages were themselves being transformed by the scale of destruction they were creating. Major Nikolai Volkov, commanding a Guards mortar regiment, later testified at a closed Communist Party hearing about the psychological state of his men. We had become machines ourselves, as automatic as our launchers. Load, aim, fire, relocate. Load, aim, fire, relocate. My men stopped talking about home, stopped writing letters. They knew what we were doing to Königsberg could be done to Moscow, to Leningrad, to any city. We were proving that cities, civilization itself, could be erased in days. Some men broke down completely, had to be removed. Others seemed to embrace it, became almost eager to fire. Both reactions frightened me equally. The mathematics of suffering in these final months defied comprehension. Soviet records, declassified only after 1991, reveal that between January and May 1945, Katyusha units fired approximately 6 million rockets at targets in Germany and Eastern Europe. Given that each rocket carried between 10 and 42 pounds of explosive, depending on type, this represented between 60,000 and 250,000 tons of explosive delivered by rocket, artillery alone. The casualties from these attacks were never accurately counted. German record-keeping collapsed, and the Soviets had no interest in documenting civilian deaths. Estimates range from 200,000 to 500,000 killed by rocket artillery in the war's final months. The weapon's psychological legacy extended far beyond immediate casualties. Wehrmacht Colonel Fritz Zimmermann, who surrendered his unit after the third day of rocket bombardment at Berlin, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We had ceased to be an army in any meaningful sense. My men would not leave their bunkers, would not follow orders, would not even maintain their weapons. They sat in the darkness, flinching at every sound, waiting for the screaming to begin again." These were veterans who had fought across Europe, reduced to terrified children by a weapon we could neither fight nor flee. When I ordered surrender, my men wept with relief. The moral burden on Soviet rocket troops became increasingly impossible to ignore. Unlike other combat arms where soldiers could maintain some fiction of military necessity, rocket artillery troops knew they were instruments of area destruction. They couldn't claim to be targeting specific military objectives when their weapon was designed to saturate entire grid squares. Veterans reported decades of nightmares, not of combat, but of the sound their weapons made. and the knowledge of what that sound meant for those beneath the falling rockets. Guard Sergeant Katya Mikhailova, whom we encountered earlier, survived the war but never recovered from it. In a 1975 interview with Soviet historians, she broke protocol by discussing the psychological cost. They give us medals, call us heroes, but heroes fight enemies who can fight back. We pulled levers and erased map coordinates. In those coordinates were people, soldiers, yes, but also women, children, elderly, all equal under our rockets. I have not slept peacefully since 1943. Every night I hear them screaming as they fall. The German civilian experience of Katyusha bombardment created traumas that would persist for generations. Children who survived developed what German psychologists would later term Katyusha syndrome, an acute fear response to certain sound frequencies similar to the rocket's distinctive howl. Decades after the war, survivors would suffer panic attacks triggered by similar sounds. Jet engines, air raid sirens, even certain musical instruments. The sound of mass rocket artillery had literally been burned into their nervous systems. Berlin's final agony in April 1945 saw the ultimate expression of the Katyusha's destructive potential. 9,000 launchers participated in the opening barrage of the Berlin operation on April 16th. In just the first 30 minutes, over 1 million rockets fell on German positions. The earth shook so violently that seismographs in Stockholm, over 800 miles away, registered the bombardment. German defenders didn't just face death. They faced the complete negation of their existence. Entire units simply vanished, leaving no bodies to bury, no trace they had ever existed. Yet even in this apocalyptic destruction, moments of humanity emerged. Soviet rocket battery commander Captain Pavel Fedorov discovered after capturing a German position that his barrage had destroyed a makeshift hospital where German medics had been treating Soviet wounded alongside their own. The revelation broke something in him. He requested transfer to a regular artillery unit, writing in his request, "I can no longer operate a weapon that does not distinguish between friend and foe, between combatant and innocent. The Katyusha has made me an indiscriminate killer, and I cannot bear this weight." The end of the war in Europe came not with a climactic battle, but with the whimpering collapse of a nation drowned in rocket fire. In the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet forces closed in on Hitler's bunker, the Katyusha batteries fell silent on May 2, 1945. The sudden absence of their howling created a silence so profound that veterans of both sides reported experiencing vertigo, as if the earth itself had stopped rotating. For 4 years, the screaming of rockets had been the voice of the Eastern Front. Now that voice was stilled, leaving only the echo in the minds of millions who had heard it. The immediate aftermath revealed the true scale of what the Katyusha had accomplished and what it had cost. Soviet statistics, compiled for internal military use and kept classified until the 1990s, showed that approximately 12 million rockets had been fired during the war. This figure, almost incomprehensible in its magnitude, represented industrial killing on a scale that previous generations could not have imagined. Each rocket had cost approximately 100 rubles to produce, about the monthly salary of a factory worker. The Soviet Union had literally fired the equivalent of 100,000 annual salaries into German positions, but the human cost transcended economics. Among the Soviet rocket forces, post-war medical examinations revealed epidemic levels of what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder. A classified study conducted by the Soviet Military Medical Directorate in 1946 found that 67% of Katyusha operators showed signs of severe psychological distress, compared to 31% in regular artillery units and 22% in infantry units. The report, suppressed by Stalin, who viewed psychological casualties as weakness, noted that rocket troops suffered particularly from moral exhaustion, the weight of having killed without discrimination or direct observation of the enemy. Viktor Suvorov, who had commanded a Katyusha battery from Stalingrad to Berlin, attempted suicide in 1947. In his survival note discovered by his wife, he wrote, "I counted once. My battery fired approximately 30,000 rockets during the war. If each rocket killed just one person, and we know they killed many more, then I am responsible for a city's worth of death. I never saw their faces, never knew their names, but I hear them every night. The rockets scream as they fall, and beneath that screaming, I hear human voices. How does one live with being a merchant of wholesale death?" On the German side, the psychological scarring was equally profound but took different forms. Civilians who had survived Katyusha bombardments showed symptoms that German psychiatrists initially struggled to categorize. Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, working with survivors in displaced persons camps, documented a syndrome he called acoustic trauma persistence. Patients who continued to hear the rocket's distinctive howl months or years after the war. Some victims reported the sound growing louder during times of stress. Others experienced the auditory hallucination so vividly that they would throw themselves to the ground in peaceful post-war settings, convinced another barrage was beginning. The children who survived carried unique wounds. Ursula Becker, 6 years old during the bombardment of Königsberg, grew up unable to tolerate sudden, loud noises. Interviewed in 1995 for a documentary about civilian war casualties, she described her experience. "I don't remember learning to walk or talk, but I remember learning the sound that meant death was coming. That howling, screaming noise is my earliest clear memory. For years after the war, I would wet myself when I heard anything similar. A factory whistle, a train brake, even strong wind. My mother said I would shake for hours afterward. The war ended when I was 6, but those rockets have followed me for 70 years. The technical legacy of the Katyusha extended far beyond its immediate military impact. Both the American and Soviet space programs would employ engineers who had worked on rocket artillery. Sergei Korolev, who would become the father of the Soviet space program, had observed Katyusha operations during the war and understood the principle of saturation that would later influence Soviet space philosophy. If precision was difficult, launch more rockets. The same industrial approach that had produced millions of simple rockets for battlefield use would enable the Soviet Union to achieve early space milestones through brute force rather than sophistication. In an extraordinary irony, NASA recruited several Soviet rocket engineers during the 1990s brain drain, including some who had worked on Katyusha improvements. Dr. Vladimir Artemyev, speaking at a NASA conference in 1997, made the connection explicit. The Katyusha taught us that simple systems in large numbers could achieve what complex systems could not. This philosophy went directly into our space program. Why build one perfect rocket when you could build 10 good enough rockets? The Americans learned precision. We learned redundancy. Both lessons came from weapons designed to kill, yet both contributed to humanity's greatest adventure. The moral reckoning with the Katyusha's legacy came slowly and incompletely. The Soviet Union celebrated the weapon as a symbol of the Great Patriotic War's victory, featuring it prominently in victory parades and monuments. Streets were named after it, songs celebrated it, and the crews who operated it were honored as heroes. But the heroes themselves often felt differently. A 1985 survey of surviving Katyusha veterans, conducted by the Soviet Veterans Committee, found that fewer than 20% had ever discussed their specific wartime role with their families. When asked why, the most common response was variations of, "How do you tell your children you operated a weapon designed to kill everything in its path?" The meeting in Volgograd in 1995 between German and Soviet veterans brought unexpected moments of recognition. When former Wehrmacht officer Hans Müller met former Katyusha commander Ivan Petrov, their conversation, recorded by journalists present, captured the shared trauma. Müller: "Your rockets, that sound, I still hear it sometimes." Petrov: "I hear it too. Every time I fired, I knew men like you were dying." Müller: "Men, women, children. Everyone died the same under your rockets." Petrov: "Yes, that's why I drink, to forget the arithmetic." Müller: The arithmetic. Petrov. Rounds fired times probable casualties. My grandson is good at mathematics. I tell him never to use it for such calculations. The philosophical implications of the Katyusha extend beyond its historical moment. It represented the democratization of mass destruction, a weapon that required minimal training to operate but could deliver catastrophic damage. It proved that technological sophistication could be defeated by crude simplicity applied in overwhelming volume. Most disturbingly, it demonstrated that warfare could be industrialized to the point where individual human agency almost disappeared. The operator pulled a lever. Coordinates on a map ceased to exist. There was no aiming at specific targets, no possibility of discrimination, no moment of human choice about who lived or died. Modern military historians argue whether the Katyusha shortened or prolonged the war. Its effectiveness in breaking German resistance possibly prevented even bloodier battles of attrition. Yet its indiscriminate nature certainly increased civilian casualties and refugee flows. What cannot be disputed is its psychological impact. The weapon changed how soldiers and civilians thought about war itself. It removed the last pretenses of combat as a contest between warriors and revealed it as industrial slaughter. Today, the Katyusha sits in museums around the world, usually displayed alongside other artifacts of the Second World War. Visitors often pass it quickly, seeing just another military vehicle, but occasionally someone stops, usually an elderly person who freezes at recognition. These are the ones who remember the sound, who know what those launch rails represent. They stand silent, perhaps remembering cowering in basements as the sky screamed, or perhaps remembering pulling the lever that made it scream. The last surviving Katyusha commander, Colonel Mikhail Fedorovich Borisov, died in 2019 at age 96. In his final interview, he was asked if he was proud of his service. His answer after a long pause was, "I did my duty. We stopped the fascists. But pride? How can you be proud of operating a weapon that kills without discrimination? We won the war, yes, but we also proved that humanity could create hell on earth with enough rockets and the will to use them. That's not pride. That's a warning." The Katyusha's ultimate legacy may be this warning, that human ingenuity applied to warfare can create weapons that transcend traditional moral boundaries, that reduce combat to mathematics and humans to statistics. The screaming rockets that drowned battlefields in fire also drowned something essential about warfare, the fiction that it could be limited, controlled, or honorable. In those screaming salvos, the world heard the sound of total war, and it was a sound that would echo through the Cold War and beyond, reminding humanity of its capacity for mechanized annihilation.